Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Wow, today we move on to level 5 of the 6 levels of theory and begin talking about chords. The most basic types of chords are called triads, and we'll be learning about them today. You'll need your slide rule and your color-coded chord and arpeggio charts. This is lesson 26, so make sure your booklet is open to page 26. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. On to some absolutely totally new stuff today. For hours now, we've been on the subject of scales. Haven't we? And the related subject of modes and the basic stuff about harmonizations. We've actually talked quite a bit about chords at one time or another. You might recall way back in the beginning, one of our first half dozen lessons, we did an hour on basic guitar chords. But a lot of you have been waiting to really learn more about really how chords actually work. And some of you might have even looked ahead, I bet, at some of these later tapes to see some of the stuff about that. I've always found that people understand the relationships between scales and chords better if you talk about scales first. So that's why we've been talking about that. Some of you probably already know a lot about chords, but today we're going to start to really get into the basic stuff about how they work. This is level number 5 of what I call my 6 levels of theory. Let's remind ourselves of what the previous levels were. Remember, I have what I call the 6 levels of pitch theory, where we're learning these 50 pitch patterns in order of complexity in 6 different increments. And remember, the first level was silence. We talked about that way back when. And then after that, we talked about the note, where we learned that everything has a root note. Then we learned about 2 basic 2-chord patterns called intervals. So things are getting a little more complex. We've gone from no notes to 1 note to 2 note. Then the notion after that is we began to string a whole bunch of intervals together, and we get scales and the related subject of modes. Well, that was number 4. Today, we are on to level number 5. And my way, basically, of thinking of these is once you understand what scales are, you kind of reach inside of a scale and you select certain notes out of that scale and you play them simultaneously. And that's what a chord is. So, level number 5 of our 6 levels of theory is chords and arpeggios. Now, we'll be talking in a minute about what arpeggios are. Chords and arpeggios. Now, you might also remember that through each of these levels of theory so far, I've been saying that there are 6 things that you have to be able to do in order to claim that you've mastered each one of these levels. And that is, you have to name it, you have to define it, you have to give examples and formulas, you have to be able to play it. In other words, you have to know the finger patterns for it. You have to be able to hear it, which means you've ear trained it so you recognize these different patterns. And finally, you have to be able to recognize it when you see it on paper as notation. So you have to be able to read it too. So we we've named it. It's called chords. And like I said, in a moment, we'll talk about what arpeggios are. Let's define it. Well, if you ask me, the best definition of what a chord is utilizes both of the previous of our 6 levels of theory, both the words intervals and the word scales. And I still to this day, I've always felt like I don't quite have the most comfortable definition of what a chord is at this point, because I try to use these other 2 words as part of my definition. But lately, what I've been saying a chord is it's simultaneously played. Simultaneously played chord note, scale notes. So as I mentioned before, you take the notes that are in a scale and you select certain notes out of the scale and you play them at the same time. Simultaneously played scale notes. But that's not really quite the whole definition yet, because we also need the word intervals in there. Intervals, as we know, is the biggest word in music theory. Everything is made of intervals. We just finished discovering that all this scale stuff is all about intervals. Chords are all about intervals too. Simultaneously played scale notes separated by specific intervals. Now, simultaneously played scale notes separated by specific intervals. Once again, the subject of intervals is going to be very important for our understanding of how chords work. One generalization that you can make about the intervals in chords is that they are generally larger intervals than the intervals that separate the notes in scales. You may recall that when all this time we spent talking about scales, the intervals that we talked about the most were seconds. Intervals called seconds. That is minor seconds, major seconds, and an occasional augmented second. Or in other words, scales are mostly made up of half steps, whole steps, and an occasional step and a half interval. Remember, a half step is called a minor second, a whole step is called a major second, a step and a half is called an augmented second. So, scales are mostly made up of seconds. What you're going to find out in a moment is, in many ways, it is fair to say that chords are more often made up of thirds, intervals of a third, and we'll be talking more about that in a second. Before we do that, I want to mention a very important word at this point, and a little distinction that I want to make sure I've covered enough. I probably have. I repeat things incessantly, don't I? But it's the best way to make sure that you guys are getting all this stuff. A word that I want to talk about at this point is the word harmony. What does harmony mean? Harmony is when you play more than one note at the same time, and how the various notes that you're playing simultaneously relate to one another, and how they sound when they're played together. So harmony is all about how multiple notes sound together. Now, as we mentioned, scales are mostly made up of seconds. Chords are mostly made up of thirds. That is, the intervals that separate the notes in conventional chords are very often thirds. And this brings up another concept that we want to mention, which is the concept of tertian harmony. Now, the word tertian is here. I'm not exactly sure what its derivation is, but tertian means 3 in this case. So what we find out is most standard harmony, that is, most chords in Western music, are constructed by taking intervals of a third and stacking them on top of each other. So tertian harmony is all about multiple notes played simultaneously that are all an interval of a third apart. Now, these can be major thirds, they can be minor thirds, or they can be augmented thirds as well. So tertian harmony involves intervals separating the notes. Intervals of major, minor, and augmented thirds. That's the big number that you want to think of when you're talking about chords, is you want to think about thirds. Major thirds, which you might recall are 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. Minor thirds, which are 3 half steps or 1.5 whole steps. And augmented thirds, interestingly enough, which is just simply an alternate name for a perfect fourth, an augmented third, which is 5 half steps or 2.5 whole steps. So, tertian harmony. Oftentimes you will hear them say that all harmony, all chords in the Western world are made up of thirds. Once again, that is simply too simple to be true, but it is kind of a basic guideline that you want to think about. Just as a matter of course, I will mention that actually in a lot of modern music, we have musicians that are now experimenting with what are called quartal harmonies. Being 4 quartal harmonies. I hope I'm spelling this right. Quartel. Quartal harmony is stuff that is made up of intervals of fourths. And I'll just kind of play a little bit on the keyboard here to have you have a chance to actually kind of hear what this kind of sounds like. Most of our conventional chords, for example, major chords and minor chords, and even dominant 7 chords. Now, some of you don't know what I'm talking about because this is what we're going to be talking about next week. A lot of these chords involve playing notes that are separated by intervals of a third. And you might recognize those as being very common sounding chords that you've heard many times before. And separated by intervals of a third. Now, in a lot of modern jazz, for example, and a lot of modern symphonic music involves these quartal harmonies, and you might recognize that you've actually heard these also. They sound a little bit different than that. Listen to these notes here that are actually separated by an interval of a fourth. Now, you might recognize that you've heard that in a lot of modern jazz. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, piano players like Chick Corea, piano players like McCoy Tyner and Herbie Hancock. A lot of modern keyboard players experiment with quartal harmony involving intervals of a fourth. It's really beyond the scope of this program to go much into that stuff. We are just talking about conventional popular music harmony, which again, as we mentioned, is mostly based on intervals of a third, and that's what we call tertian harmony right there. Now, the next big facts that you would want to understand about harmony and about chords is this. We mentioned this way back when we initially talked about chords several way back when lessons ago. Remember this fact about chords. All chords have roots. Remember, every chord has what's known as its root note. It is the foundation note that the chord is basically built off of. So all chords have roots. Now, here's a bit of new information. It kind of leads us into what our subject really today is all about. Another thing that you want to understand is chords are basically built on basic 3-note groupings of notes called triads. So all chords have roots, and chords generally, conventional chords are built on triads, and that's our main subject for today. These kind of proto chords, these very basic harmonic arrangements that we call triads. Now, there are 4 different types of triads, and we're going to be talking about all 4 of those today. And these 4 types are divided into 2 subgroups, and these groups have fascinating properties to them. So, chords are built on triads. There are 4 types of triads, and these are divided into 2 different subgroups. 2 of these types of triads are very common, and you've heard of them many, many times before, and you've played them many times. The other 2 are not quite as common in popular music, although people that really understand what's going on in music, even though they may not be as common, give them equal credence. All 4 of these types of triads, which we're going to delineate here in a moment, are equally important conceptually, although you will find that only 2 of them are you going to wind up playing a lot in rock and roll and in pop music all that much. Now, the first type of triad, the most, shall we say, common type of triad, which we all know about, is a major triad. So, number 1 here is a major triad. Now, we know that we're looking at one of these when we just see, for example, in the songbook, they're showing us how to play a particular chord or a particular triad, and we just see an alphabet letter. Now, I'm gonna write these as if they're in the key of C, but of course they could be in any one of the 12 keys, right? It could be an F, or it could be a D, or it could be a B flat or an A flat. But let's say you're reading through a piece of music and they're telling you what chords to play, and all of a sudden you see just the letter C or the letter F or whatever. Well, with no other letters or anything after that, you can assume that what they're asking you to play is a major chord or a major triad. Now, hopefully we have mentioned this enough times just in conversation through the program here and way back when we originally talked about chords. You probably already know the numeric spelling for a major triad, right? You hopefully remember that it's 1, 3, 5. That's what a major triad actually is. Now, once again, I have a slightly different way of looking at this stuff than it's presented a lot of times. Even though these are called triads, I want to suggest that you actually think of them as having 4 notes in them. The reason being that I think most of the ways you're going to look at triads, you're not going to want to forget your octave note up here. So really, even though it's a triad, 1, 3, 5, I say think of note number 8, too. Remember, note number 8 is your octave note up there. When we begin in a moment to examine the distances between these notes, that is the intervals, and we're saying once again that the distances that separate these different patterns are crucial to know about, it's going to be very important to understand what the interval is between 5 and 8 up here, too. So, the first type of triad, you've seen them 1,000 times. Whenever you've seen just that letter G or that letter D or that letter B flat or that letter A flat, you're being asked to play a major chord or a major triad, as we see, with the 3-note patterns. Now, I bet you are already speculating about what the second one would be, and I bet you pretty much know what it is. There are major triads, 1, 3, 5. I'm sure you also know that there are minor triads. Now, do you remember this? Well, actually, before we get to that, now remember, the way you recognize these when you see them written in a songbook or something is generally the letter, for example, in this case, C, and then with an M after it. For minor, C minor. Now, sometimes you'll also see the jazz guys, for example, writing just in a kind of shorthand that they often use C with a little minus sign after that. So minus can also mean minor too. So C minor, CM is C minor, but also C with a minus sign sometimes you'll see. Now, I'm sure we've mentioned this one enough time too. Certainly in our discussions of scales, we talked about what the difference between a major scale and a minor scale is. It all has to do with that number 3, doesn't it? And remember, major patterns contain note number 3. Minor patterns do not contain note number 3. They contain the note that is 1/2 step below that, which of course is the flatted third. So a minor triad, of course, goes 1, flat 3, 5, 8. Those are your 2 most common types of triads, and overwhelmingly in popular music, in rock and roll, these are the chords that you're seeing the most often, major and minor. Now, and these fall into one subgroup, the first subgroup here, and we'll be mentioning what distinguishes them from the second subgroup in a moment. But let's actually look at what these other 2 types of triads are. In more sophisticated music, in classical music, and in jazz, you see these chords a lot more often, but you don't see them so much in pop rock music. But as I mentioned before, all real musicians give these chords or these triads equal credence with all of the other ones too. You might have been looking through a songbook at one time or another, and you might have seen the alphabet letter. Again, I'm just using C, but it could be any one of the notes. C, and then you see the word or the letters A-U-G after it. This is what's known as an augmented triad. Now, remember, we had augmented intervals as well, didn't we? Here again, we see this word augmented in relation to chords, in relation to triads, augmented triads. C with an AUG. Another little shorthand you will see sometimes is C or whatever alphabet letter with a little plus sign. Plus is often a shorthand for augmented, like that. Now, some of you may know what an augmented triad is already, but if you don't, here it is. It has a certain relationship to a major triad in that it has a 1 and a 3 in it. So people are going, well, okay, it's a major triad, but I go, actually, it has a slight difference. It does not contain note number 5. Remember, 5 is the second most important note in all of music, and most of our patterns contain note number 5. But this is one of those patterns that doesn't. This contains the note that is 1/2 step higher than note number 5. It's a sharp 5. 1-3 sharp 5 is an augmented triad, and once again I encourage people, don't forget the 8. Don't forget your octave note up here for reasons mostly we'll be talking about in the next couple of hours, but for now, just remember, it's very important to also know how much distance it requires to get you back up to the next octave note again, too. So you might have already guessed what our 4th type of triad is. Major, minor, augmented. What's that other important word we see all the time? You're reading through a songbook and you see a letter, say C, with D-I-M after it. This is a diminished triad. This is often written C with a little 0 after it. Diminished is often expressed with a small 0. This is a diminished triad. Now, you take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. I've got 5 boxes down here. Here I'm calling this thing a triad, but I've got 5 different boxes here. You'll see what I mean in a second. 1. A diminished triad has a certain relationship to a minor triad in that it has a flatted third, 1 flat 3. So what distinguishes it from a minor triad, once again, is what's going on with the 5. This is some of this stuff in music, the more rare, the less common stuff that does not involve note number 5. A diminished triad has a flatted 5th in it. And also, don't forget the octave note up here. And I'm going to leave this one blank for a second. I'll talk about this, what this 5th note is all about here in just a minute. There are your 4 different types of basic triads. These are the building blocks of most of the the chords that we use actually in the songs that we play. 4 different types of triads. Major, 1-3-5 with the 8, of course. Minor, 1 flat 3-5. With the octave note. Augmented, 1-3 sharp 5 with the octave note. Diminished, 1 flat 3 flat 5 with the octave note up there. Now, as I mentioned before, these 4 types of triads are divided into 2 subgroups, and these subgroups have very interesting properties about them, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. What all this involves is the intervals between the notes, the spacing between the notes. As we've said several times already today, once again, just like in the subject of scales, the concept of intervals becomes critically important when you're talking about chords. It really isn't what notes you play when you play music. It's all about how far apart these notes are from one another. As we mentioned before, scales, mostly the notes are separated by half steps, whole steps, and 1.5 intervals, seconds. The intervals that separate the notes in chords are generally larger than that. They are generally thirds. Let's go back through these again, and now not just look at the notes that are in them, but look at how far apart they are from one another. Hopefully by now you've got your intervals memorized. Remember, you guys got to keep looking back at your old tapes back there and learning this stuff. Intervals is the most important word in all of music theory, and that whole page of intervals, you have to make sure you've got that memorized. And also, if you have your musical number system in front of you at this particular moment, you'll be able to look at these different triad patterns and with me be able to figure out how far apart the notes are from one another. Let's first look at our major triad down here. 1-3-5-8. How far apart are these notes from one another? First of all, how far is it from note number 1 to note number 3? Do you remember what the name of that interval is? Well, not surprisingly, hopefully you remember that's an interval called a major third. The distance from the first note to the third note of a major scale is a major interval. It's called a major third. How large an interval is a major third? You remember? You should by now. It's one of your most important intervals. A major third can be thought of two ways. It can either be thought of as 4 half steps or 2 whole steps. Remember, it's do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3. How far is it from 1 to 3? 1, 3, 1, 3. It's 2 whole steps, which of course would be 4 half steps, wouldn't it? Let's write this down here using half steps. So it's important to remember that the distance between note number 1 and note number 3 is 4 half steps, and it's an interval of a major third. Remember, we're suggesting tertian harmony here. Intervals that separate the notes in chords are generally thirds. That's a major third. Now, how far is it from note number 3 to note number 5? People go, oh, 1, 3, 5, isn't it? Oh, it's the same, right? 4. And I go, no, actually it's not if you look at your musical number system, because there's that half step between 3 and 4. The distance between note number 3 and note number 5 is not 4 half steps. I tried to make these boxes even show that. It's a little bit closer together. It's 1 half step closer together. It is only a step and a half from 3 to 5. It's only 3 half steps from 3 to 5. That's an interval, of course, of a minor third. And that is 3 half steps. So let's put that number here. It is only 3 half steps between note number 3 and note number 5. Now, we have one more interval here. We have the distance between note number 5 and note number 8. How far is that? Well, how about this for a little bit of a review? Remember way back to when we talked about the 3 most important notes in all of music? 1, 5, 8. We also examined the intervals between those notes. From 1 to 8 was an octave. From 1 to 5 was a perfect fifth. Do you remember what the interval was between 5 and 8? I'll give you another clue. If you remember your intervals, it was an inverted perfect fifth. Do you remember what the inverted interval for a perfect fifth is? It's a perfect fourth, right? From note number 5 to note number 8 is an interval of a perfect fourth. Now, in this case, some of you might disagree with me on this, but in this case, just to bring it back again to the concept of tertian harmony, where we're suggesting that all these notes are separated by intervals of a third, I'm going to just kind of stretch that a little and suggest then that even the interval from 5 back up to 8, which we know as a perfect fourth, could be described as a third. Remember, a perfect fourth has an alternate name. Sometimes it's known as an augmented third. So let's use that in this case. Let's say that from 5 back up to 8 is not a perfect fourth. It's an augmented third. Then that allows us to suggest that all of the notes in a major triad are separated by intervals of a third. 1 to 3 is a major third. 3 to 5 is a minor third, and 5 to 8 is an augmented third. Remember, an augmented third, or a perfect fourth, is 5 half steps. So the distance from 5 to 8 is actually 5 half steps. Now, if we add those up, 4 half steps, 3 half steps, and 5 half steps, what does that equal? Equals 12, right? That's an octave, isn't it? 12 half steps in an octave. So, of course, the intervals that separate these notes would have to equal 12. Now, that's a major triad. All thirds, major third, minor third, augmented third, separating the notes in it. Now let's take a look at a minor triad, our second type of triad. 1, flat 3, 5, 8. How far is it from note number 1 to flat 3? Well, hopefully you remember that's an interval of a minor third, isn't it? Which is 1.5 whole steps or 3 half steps. So the distance from 1 to flat 3 is 3 half steps. Now, how far is it from flat 3 to 5? Well, a moment ago we saw that from 3 to 5 was 3 half steps in our major triad up here. If we're now going from flat 3, see how this interval is shrunk by 1 half step here? Well, this one expands by 1 half step. So now the distance from flat 3 up to 5, if you're looking at your musical number system, actually turns out to be a major third interval now, which is, of course, is 4 half steps. So the distance from flat 3 to 5 is 4 half steps. Once again, this stays the same over here, doesn't it? The distance from 5 to 8 is that augmented third i.e. perfect fourth, which is 5 half steps. Once again, we see that these all add up to 12. It's just that the smaller interval, the minor third, comes first, and then the major third comes after that, and then finally our augmented third up here. Major and minor triads are the most common triads and belong to subgroup number 1, which will, as I said, we'll mention the distinction between those in just a moment here. Let's go over here to our other 2 types of triads, augmented and diminished triads. Now, again, we have to look at the intervals that separate these notes. By the way, if you know the intervals that separate them and you remember your interval fingerings, you might well be able to invent for yourself fingerings for these different chords. Of course, we already showed you the basic fingerings for major and minor chords way back when in our initial discussion on chords. And we'll be looking at that finger chart here in a few minutes, too, to remind ourselves of how that works. But what we're really doing now is looking more at the structure of these within a music theory context. But what I'm suggesting is if you remember the fingerings for your intervals, you could either invent the fingerings for the triads yourself, or you could certainly look back at your original sheet of chords that had all those major and minor chords on it, and you could see the intervals that separate the notes are there. In those are exactly what we're saying they are here, all thirds. Now, our third type of triad is an augmented triad, and it is spelled 1, 3, sharp 5, 8. Let's take a look at the distances that separate the notes in these triads. From 1 to 3, what interval is that? That's an interval of a major third, isn't it? How large an interval is a major third? It is 4 half steps, or 2 whole steps, as we noticed over here in our major triad. So the distance between 1 and 3 is 4 half steps. Now, how far is it from 3 to sharp 5? Well, from 3 to 5, you might recall, was a minor third. It was 3 half steps, but now we've expanded that interval by 1 half step from 3 up to sharp 5. So now that also becomes a major third. So there's 4 half steps in between 3 and sharp 5. Now, what that means is now that we've raised the 5 up to a sharp 5, the distance between this note and the octave has shrunk by 1 half step. Remember, it was an augmented third, which is 5 half steps, but now the distance from sharp 5 to 8 is 1 half step smaller than that. It's 4 half steps, or again, an interval of a major third. What you're about to see in a moment, I'm sure you've noticed this already, take a look at this. The distances between the notes in an augmented triad are all the same. They're all 4 half steps apart from one another. Now, let's take a look at our last type of triad down here, a diminished triad. 1, flat 3, flat 5, and in a moment we'll see what this note is, and then we also have 8 down here too. What are the distances between these notes? What interval separates 1 and flat 3? It's 3 half steps, isn't it? It's an interval of a minor third. So there are 3 half steps between 1 and flat 3. Now, how far is it from flat 3 to flat 5? You might recall when we looked at minor triads a moment ago that went from flat 3 up to perfect fifth up here, that was actually an interval of a major third, which is 4 half steps, but now we have shrunk that interval by flatting the fifth here, and turns out that it's now a minor third between flat 3 and flat 5. So once again, that is 3 half steps between flat 3 and 5 here. Now, if we look at the distance between flat 5 and 8, you're going to find out that that when we went from 5 to 8, that was an interval of an augmented third or a perfect fourth, which is 5 half steps. But now, since we've diminished the fifth here, since we've dropped it by a half step, we've increased this interval from flat 5 up to 8 by a half step. Turns out to actually be 6 half steps from flat 5 up to 8. That's why I included this other box here, because can you see what's going on here, basically? What we're beginning to notice is in this second group of triads, the second subgroup of triads, we have patterns of notes that are all the same distance apart from one another. Here we had 4, 4, and 4. Here, so far, we've got 3, 3, and 6. But if I include this other note right here, then we would see that there's actually 3 half steps here and another 3 half steps here. This note, interestingly enough, is note number 6 in our musical number system. But in most contexts, interestingly enough, and I don't know whether I've mentioned this enough to stick in your mind, this note is not generally referred to as note number 6. It is generally referred to, believe it or not, as a double flatted 7. If I didn't, I think I mentioned this way back when we were in our notation section, but there are sharps and flats, as I'm sure you know, and there are also naturals. There are also double sharps and double flats. And people go, what the heck do you use those for? And like I said, you'll see. And I mentioned some of those things in the notation section here. But this note right here, which is halfway between the flat 5 and the 8, is note number 6 in our musical number system, but it's generally in this context referred to as a double flatted 7. It's a thing called a diminished 7th. You might recall that from our discussion on intervals. We had major 7ths, which were 11 half steps. We had minor 7ths, which were 10 half steps, and we had major 6ths, which were also known as diminished 7ths, diminished 7th intervals, which were 9 half steps, and they were the distance between note number 1 and note number 6, or in this context known as double flatted 7. That's a thing called a diminished 7th. It's not a major 7th. It's not a flatted 7th. It's a double flatted 7th called a diminished 7th. The reason I'm writing this here is later on we're going to be talking about the distinction between what's known as a diminished triad and a diminished 7th chord. We'll also be talking about something that some of you may have wondered about for a while, which is the difference between a full diminished chord and what's known as a half diminished chord, which you might have heard of. But right now we're mostly talking about triads, 3 groupings of 3 notes here, but as I've said, I think it's very important to always include the octave note in your discussion of harmony, in your discussion of triads, so you can visualize the distance between in the last interval, getting you back up to the octave there. Going to be particularly important when we talk about inverting these triads and inverting these chords. And in the case of diminished, since what we're trying to paint a picture here of, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, is that what we're going to find is that major and minor triads are all separated by different distances. None of these notes are the same distance apart from one another, are they? Look in augmented and diminished, these are all 4 half steps apart, these are all 3 half steps apart, and that's it. Remember, we said there are 4 types of triads divided into 2 subgroups, and this is what these 2 subgroups are all about. Let's look at our 2 most common types of triads, major and minor triads. They are in the first subgroup here. What is it that unites them and differentiates them between these other 2 types of triads? And that is, these are what are known as the unequal interval triads. These are the unequal triads. Whereas in subgroup number 2 over here, augmented and diminished, these are the equal interval triads. The notes in augmented and diminished are all the same distance apart. Augmented, they're all major thirds apart. Diminished, they're all minor thirds apart. Back to the major and minor ones over here. Now, way back when we talked about the note, when we talked about root notes, we suggested that every chord has a root note. And we understand that as an intellectual concept, but we also suggested that in the end, that's going to be one of your great ear training challenges, is to be able to listen to a chord and be able to tell by ear where its root note is. Now, I'm going to go up here to the piano for a moment, and I'm going to play a chord, and let's say this was an ear training exercise that we were going to do. I would be asking myself if I could hear what the root note of that triad was. Now, see if you agree with me. I'm going to listen to this chord, and I'm going to try to figure out what its root note is. I listen to that chord, and my ear tells me that That's the root note of that chord. Now, a lot of my students that I have up here on the Cape, if I do that for them, even without any training at all, many of them are able to pick out the root note of the chord. And then I ask them, okay, how did you do that? You've had no real formal ear training at all. How was it that I could play a chord and that your ear was able to tell where the root note of the chord is? And a lot of them go, I don't really know. I don't really know how I did that. I just, that sounded to me like it was the root note of the chord. And I go, well, okay, let me suggest. I'm kind of overstating this concept a little, but let me suggest that I know what it was that allowed your ear to hear that that was the root note of that particular chord. You see, since all of the notes in a major triad are all different distances apart, let me suggest that in a way, what your ear did was it went in there and it's learned by listening to music. You've been ear training all your life. Remember, the act of listening to music is a form of ear training. You have learned the trick of your ear has gotten in there and kind of learned to measure the distances between the notes, delivering you one particular answer. That, for example, that note right there was the root note. You've kind of learned, your mind has kind of learned to do this measuring trick. I'm going to suggest that it is the very unequalness of the distances between the notes that allowed you to come up with that conclusion. Since all of the notes are different distances apart, they can only kind of fit together in one way. Each of the individual notes in that pattern can only occupy one specific position. The 4 half steps have to be in one particular place, and the 3 half steps have to be in another place, and the 5 half steps in another place. And like I said, I'm overstating this in a way, but your mind has learned the trick of being able to figure out where the 4, the 3, and the 5 are, which points you in the direction of going, oh, okay, that's the root note right there. So you come up with the answer, do. So, within an unequal interval triad, each note has a very specific position in the triad and a very specific function relative to the intervals that separate it from the other notes in the pattern. So, in unequal interval triads, each note has a specific function. If this note is 3 half steps above that note has to be functioning as the 5th. You know what I mean? It is the very unequalness of the intervals that creates the specific function for each one of the notes. And of course, the most coveted function of all, or the most important function of all, is that root note down there. A simplified way of stating this is that unequal interval triads have one obvious root note. And so a lot of people get in the habit of going, oh, well, in major and minor triads, which are unequal interval triads, there's only one note that could be the root. And I go, very good, that's important to know. But what that means is there's only one note that could be the 3rd, and there's only one note that could be the 5th. Each one of these notes has a very specific relationship because they're all different distances apart. So they could never function as something else. The 5th could never function as the 3rd because it's like it's 3 half steps above where the 3rd is. See what I mean? Now, the same thing is going on in minor triads down here. These are all different distances apart from one another, and your mind, although a lot of my beginning ear training students have a harder time differentiating where the root of minor chords are, without much work, very often they can get to the point where they do. Here's a minor triad on the piano up here, and I play this for them, and here's that 1 flat 3 5 up here. Doesn't it sound sad? Remember, major stuff sounds happy with the major 3rd. Minor stuff sounds sad with the flatted 3rd. And I'll play this for one of my students, and I'll go, okay, can you hum for me the root note of this? Do. Very often they can also have a very distinct opinion as to which of the notes is the root note in the minor triad too. Once again, because your ear has learned the trick of going in there and measuring the distances between the notes, and since they're all different, there's only one way the puzzle can fit together. I have this analogy where I go, let's say you had a jigsaw puzzle, and that jigsaw puzzle had 4 parts to it. It had 4 pieces. If all of those pieces were different shapes, as they generally are in a jigsaw puzzle, aren't they? If each of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle were, the 4 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle were a different shape, there would only be one way that you could put that puzzle together, right? You know what I mean? And so that yields a very specific function for each of the notes in unequal interval triads. And of course, the most important function is for your ear to be able to get in there and hear where the actual root note of the chord is. But that should also tell you where the 5th is, and it should also tell you where the flatted 3rd is. Now, interestingly enough, in equal interval triads, your augmented and diminished, it is not quite so cut and dried how each note is going to be functioning in the triad. And if I start ear training augmented and diminished chords with my students, very often it's like all of a sudden they don't have any idea where the root note is anymore. Now, here's our good old friend, the major triad again. Sounds happy. Here's our minor triad with the flatted 3rd. Now, how about this? Our first triad that we might want to look at is our first equal interval triad is an augmented triad where we take the 1 and the 3 and the 5, but we take the 5 here and we raise it by a half step. And you have this augmented triad. And if I add the 8 up here, it's like 1, 3, sharp, 5, 8. Now, remember way back when we were talking about the chords in the beginning, we suggested there were 50 different types of chords, and they all have different moods they express. Most people would agree that major chords sound happy, minor chords sound sad. Well, what did you think about that augmented chord? Let's listen to that again. Well, you know what I think? You might have a different opinion. I always think that augmented stuff sounds kind of like surprised. It's almost like somebody said something surprising to you and you're going, huh? Don't you agree? That's just my funny little picture of it, but huh? You know what I mean? It is much more difficult for people to tell where the root notes of augmented and diminished triads are because all the notes are the same distance apart. So in a sense, for example, that, in a way, could function as the 1. If it did, that would be the 3, and that would be the sharp 5. You see, and if that was the 1, then that could function as the 3, and then that could function as the sharp 5. It's like, if all the notes are the same distance apart, it's really kind of hard to tell how the whole puzzle fits together. Remember my analogy a minute ago. If you have a jigsaw puzzle and it's got 4 parts, and all the parts are different shapes, there's only one way to put the puzzle together. But now, what if you had a jigsaw puzzle that had 4 pieces, but what if the 4 pieces were all the same shape? There would be more than one way to put that puzzle together, wouldn't there? How many there would be, I'm not going to go into, but there would certainly be more than one way to put that puzzle together. The same thing is going on with diminished chords down here. Notice that a diminished triad, and then expanding that to be a diminished 7th chord containing this double flatted 7 here. All the notes are 3 half steps apart from one another. Once again, now let's listen to a diminished chord or a diminished triad. This is our 4th type of triad. Well, what does this make you feel emotionally? If you were going to kind of come up with an emotional signature for this chord to help you recognize it by ear, what does it make you feel? You know what I think it is? I call this the woman tied to the railroad tracks chords. For all of you folks old enough to remember the old silent movies, this is the very tense and fearful sounding chord. Doesn't this kind of sound like fear? You know what I mean? So 4 types of triads. Major sounds happy, minor sounds sad. To me, augmented sounds like surprised, and diminished sounds like fear. It sounds like fright. Diminished triad, equal interval triads. All the notes are the same distance apart from one another. Once again, it becomes very difficult for my students to be able to tell where the root note in the chord is. And again, I'm just talking about the root note, but then I'm suggesting that the function of each one of the notes is kind of up for grabs. This is 1, flat 3, 5, but what if this was 1? Then this would be flat 3, and this would be flat 5, and this would be double flat 7. In equal interval triads, the relationship of each note in the pattern is much less cut and dried. And in fact, the only way you can actually tell which note is functioning as the root note, particularly in diminished triads, is by examining its context within the specific piece of music you're playing. So, equal interval triads, there is not necessarily any specific function for each of the notes. No specific function. Any one of the notes in there could function as the root. So people go, well, then if that's true, how can you tell which of the notes in the pattern is actually functioning as the root? And the answer is, as I mentioned a moment ago, you purely have to examine it from the point of view of context. I'll show you what I mean. Let's take a diminished chord up here. The four notes that I'm playing up here, 1, flat, 3, flat, 5, 8. I'm actually starting on good old C again. The notes are C, E flat, G flat, and A. Now, what I'm suggesting is in one song, you might see this labeled as a C diminished chord. You got the very same notes written, C, E flat, G flat, A, played over a C bass note. You might see that labeled as a C diminished chord. But you might flip a few pages further on in your booklet, and in a different song, in a different key, you might see those exact same notes. C, E flat, G flat, and A, played over an E flat bass note. You might see those exact same notes labeled as an E flat diminished chord. And then you flip a few more pages in the book to another song in a different key. You see exactly the same notes again, but this time it's played over G flat. And that same set of notes is labeled as a G flat diminished chord. Finally, played over A, it might be labeled as A flat, as an A diminished chord or an A diminished triad. So it is much less cut and dried how each of the notes is actually going to function, and you can only basically tell how these things are going to function by looking at their context within the song, and what I mean by that is generally you look to see which note is being used as the bass note underneath the chord. And because of the key that you're in and the particular type of progression that you're playing, the augmented or diminished triad will be named after that bass note. In my experience, that's the way it works anyway. So there it is. Those are your 4 different types of triads. Another thing that I want to mention about these equal interval triads is because of the very fact that the relationships are not so quite and cut and dried. The specific functions are not there with each note. That gives these chords very specific and very specialized types of functions within songs. They, particularly in terms of diminished chords, they give these chords almost magical properties, which isn't that kind of funny. I've always found this rather fascinating in modern music. Diminished chords have a lot of very interesting properties. Some people would suggest, for example, that they don't really exist within a key. They don't really exist in any key. It's almost fair to say that a diminished chord or a diminished triad has like 1 foot in several different keys. It gives these things very specialized properties. It allows them to do rather magical things, particularly in the area of what's called modulation, which we're going to be to in a couple of hours, in pieces that actually change key right in the middle of the chord progression. Remember, most of the diatonic harmonizations that we've done so far have involved a song staying in a specific key all the way through the song, but you're going to find out a lot of music doesn't do that. A lot of music actually changes key, and to do that, we use what are called pivot chords to pivot us out of one key into another key. Because diminished chords have like 1 foot in several different keys, they can be very significant in modulating chord progressions that change key right in the middle of the song. They are also very much used in another area of chording called substitution. There are certain chords that can be substituted for other chords. There are other chords that, to make a chord progression more interesting, that you can stick in between the normal chords in the chord progression. Diminished chords are very important and very significant to do that too, because of the equalness of the intervals and because they're kind of slippery. You know, you can't quite get a hold of them, and that gives them their specialized properties. But also, interestingly enough, I think that also explains why in modern popular music, in rock music, they are much less common. Because as I've said so many times before, you're going to hate to hear me say this, but the pop rock musicians walking around on the street, very often, they might be making millions of bucks, but they really are not necessarily the most knowledgeable or the most ear-trained musicians that you're ever going to bump into. And so, isn't it funny that chords that have very fascinating and specialized properties are often practically non-existent in the music, because these are also harder for us to control. They're harder for us to control by ear. They're like slippery, and we can't quite get a hold of them. And that's partially because of the unequalness of the intervals. It's also because, let me also remind you, that in both augmented and diminished triads, we don't have the fifth. Remember, what are the three most important notes in all of music? 1, 5, 8. And as I mentioned before, 99.9% of the moments in popular music that you're going to hear all involve those three notes, 1, 5, 8. Patterns that do not have a 5 in them, for example, augmented with its sharp 5 and diminished with its flatted 5, are much less common in popular music. And again, it's because a lot of rock and roll type players are not necessarily ear trained well enough to really understand how to control sharp and flat 5s quite so much. Now, in the last couple of minutes here, I want to show you this. If you're wondering how to play these different types of triads, let me remind you that way back when we looked at this particular finger chart, actually I don't have it up here, but I think we originally wrote this out on a piece of beige paper here with black stuff, but in your support material package, you have this chart right here, which was, remember, way back when we learned there were 50 different types of chords, but we only looked at 6: major, minor, dominant 7, minor 7, major 7, and these things called power chords over here. Remember, your first two columns here are major chords and minor chords, and these, remember, there's the 5 different forms that you can play these in. If you want to go back and review, at this point, it's been so many weeks since we looked at our chords, you might want to go back and review that tape on our basic chords. 50 different types of chords, remember, 12 of any type, but there's only 5 basic possible finger forms. You already know how to play all your major and minor chords on the guitar. We did not include augmented and diminished at that point because they are not as common. We are going to be, in the next 2 hours, as we continue to look at chords, we are going to begin to look at the fingerings for augmented and diminished chords, as well as all the other different types of chords that you're going to be learning about too. But here you already have the fingerings for major and minor triads. So if you don't have those memorized already, go back and look at that sheet and get that stuff happening. Remember, with my color coding system here, excuse me, another important thing to remember is the color coding system. 1, 3, 5 is a major triad, right? So that's going to be red, yellow, blue. I thought that was pretty cool. The 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, are the colors of your triads. So in these finger charts here, you can very clearly see where your root notes are because they're in red. You can see where your 5th is because that's in blue, and you can also see where your 3rds are. Remember, minor stuff has a flatted 3rd, so that's why you see the yellow dot. This is the minor column here. You have your yellow dot, but it also has a little flat sign in it, indicating that that's a flatted 3rd. You have 5 different basic finger forms to play a minor chord with too, and so that's what that chart was all about. Want to leave you with a couple of last thoughts here. First of all, remember our subject for today is chords. Actually, we haven't really started looking at chords yet. We've been looking at the basic types of chords that are called triads. But another word that we mentioned up here before is what an arpeggio is, and I didn't actually define what an arpeggio is yet. Chords we know to be simultaneous notes. So, and not only that, they are simultaneous notes separated by very specific intervals, generally thirds. So, for example, here is a C major chord. 1, 3, 5. Starting on C, that's C, E, G. If you look at your musical slide rule. Oh, let me show you that too. Another thing that I haven't mentioned today is your slide rule. All up till now, we've been looking at this slide, the side of the slide rule over here that was all about scales, all the diatonic scales. Now we're going to flip the slide rule over. Here is the spelling of all your basic chords here. Chords and arpeggios is on the back side of your slide rule here. Now, if you look up along the top here, here's major triads, 1, 3, 5. Here's augmented triads, 1, 3, sharp 5. Over here is, along the top, is your minor triad, 1, flat 3, 5. And finally, here's your diminished triad, or your diminished 7th chord, 1, flat 3, flat 5, double flat 7 up there. Next week, we're going to talk about how to take all of these triads and flesh them out to be the more important the more important, or I don't mean important, the larger chords, like the ones with the numbers after them, like 7s and 6s and 9s and all that. Now, back to this concept of the arpeggio here. Remember, a chord is when you play notes simultaneously. In the case of a major chord, for example, 1, 3, 5. Remember, these also have intervals of a third separating them. What is an arpeggio? An arpeggio is a different type of pitch pattern. It kind of floats in between scales and chords. What an arpeggio is when you take the notes that are in a chord, but you don't play them simultaneously. You play them in a sequence like this. See that? Those are the notes that are in that chord, separated by the intervals that are in that chord. But if I play the notes in a sequence, instead of playing them all simultaneously, that's what an arpeggio is. Now let me grab my guitar here for a second too and show you, like a lot of you have a kind of a misconception about what you're doing when you're playing chords. Here's a C major chord on the guitar, as I'm sure you know. C played in the C form. Now, people often, the misnomer is they go, okay, I'm going to pluck the individual notes in a chord. Like that. See how with my picking hand back here, I'm actually picking the individual notes. And they think, well, I'm finger picking or I'm plucking a chord. You're actually not. That's an arpeggio. If I had strummed all these chords at the same time, or all these notes at the same time, like that, that would have been a chord, but this is an arpeggio. Or a lot of you know, in various styles of music, you do finger picking, where you use each of your individual fingers as a pick. People like James Taylor, Paul Simon. See how I'm using each of my individual fingers here? You're actually playing an arpeggio there. You're not really playing a chord.